Mike asked me to talk a bit about a sort of different approach to criminology than at least was common in the last century, and is still, I think, not as common as more traditional person-focused approaches to doing something about crime. So my presentation is the law of crime concentration and the criminology of place. So conventional criminology, and I've done some research on this, is highly focused on people. In other words, the idea is, why do people commit crime? What can you do to change people so they won't commit crime or change their circumstances? So it's also the case, besides whodunit, that criminologists have looked at crime in communities. And they've asked, why do certain communities have higher crime rates than other communities? This is, for example, from a figure more than 100 years ago at the Chicago School, looking at where they thought crime was centered in the center of the city in Chicago. Early in my career, though, I began to think about something a little different. My first job, actually, before I finished graduate school, was at the Vera Institute of Justice in New York. And I was the evaluator for a new community policing program in Brooklyn. And this is talked about in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. He does a good job describing this. But in any event, we had, in this community policing program, you had a community police officer that went on the street, walked around, not in a car, worked with talking to citizens, and their job was to identify the problems and do something about it. And I walked with these police for a year in each of these 9 beats. And what I discovered quite quickly was that they kept going back to the same places. Now, I should note that this precinct in New York is, at the time, now is very gentrified, but at the time was one of the highest crime precincts in New York City, at a time when New York City had 3,000 murders a year. And these beats, as they were called, these 9 beats, were the hot spots within this, the areas with high crime, the delinquency areas, if you like, within these precincts. And what I found was we kept returning to 1 or 2 streets. And that led me to the idea that we shouldn't be focusing on communities when we think about geography and crime. We should be focusing on, in my case, a lot of my work is on single street segments, but often a single street segment or a cluster. Well, I was just going to say location, location, location. So for my idea about criminology, you have to start thinking about where done it rather than who done it. So when I talk about hotspots, I'm talking about something very different than communities. On the left side is a single street segment. A lot of the intervention work I've done, the theoretical work I've done, and basic research I've done has been on the street segment. And on the right side of the screen is a cluster of street segments. This is a prostitution market in Jersey City, New York in the late 1990s. So the important part is that we're taking, in my view, my type of criminology, move from the idea of people or criminals and communities to the idea of hotspots. So key to this idea about hotspots and what makes them important in doing something about the crime problem has to do with the concentration of crime in cities. So in 2015, I wrote an article that was published in Criminology, and I was able to look at crime concentration using crime incident data in a group of cities. Here you have Sacramento, Seattle, New York, Tel Aviv, and Cincinnati. And what you can see here, there's an incredible amount of consistency and concentration in crime in cities. In these 5 larger cities, about between 50% of crime is found between 4 and 6% of streets. Now, the logic here, of course, is if most of the crime is found on a relatively small number of streets, you ought to be focusing on those streets and not the entire areas that they're located in. If you look at the 25% of crime, 25% of the crime in these cities varies between less than 1% and 1.6% of the streets. In other words, you can get about 25% of the crime in a larger city. I've now done this in 40 or 50 cities by just looking at 1 or 2% of the streets. And when I talk about a street, I'm talking about a street segment, intersection to intersection. This law of crime concentration idea is not just that crime concentrations are very strong in cities, and there's a tremendous consistency across cities. It's also over time. So what you have here is Tel Aviv, Yafo, and Seattle, Washington. And on the bottom of the slide, you have the concentrations, the 1%, the 25% of crime line, and the 50% of crime line. You can see that the The 50% of crime line stays around 5% over a 16-year period in one, and an 11-year period in the other. And this is true of the 1% line, the 25% of crime line as well. So in other words, concentrations of crime are highly stable across cities and within cities. So this idea that there's at least a general average concentration of crime across cities seemed to be strongly held. And certainly it suggests that the crime is very, very concentrated in cities, not only in the US, but across the world. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about this slide. Emile Durkheim in the 19th century suggested that crime, the amount of crime in society, would stay at about a normal rate unless there was some social chaos. And what you can see here is across the period, the two bottom lines are pretty stable. But the line on the top, which is associated with the right side of the figures, or is the amount of crime in a year. In Seattle, at the same time, for example, the crime remained at about 50% of crime remained at about 5% of the street segments. Crime went down about 25%. So, of course, an important question, if you're thinking about this, is, well, maybe that's just a sort of general rule that every year about, 50% of crime is found at 5% of the streets. And I should note there are a lot more crime than streets in the cities you're looking at. So they could be dispersed across all streets in the city. They're not. But you would ask the question, maybe each year it's different. Maybe it's a kind of regression to the mean problem or some other statistical problem. So what you have here is some analysis we did in the city of Seattle, in which we use group-based trajectory model, which allows you to create similar trajectories over time for individual streets. So we took 24,000 streets, we created a trajectory for each street, and then we grouped those trajectories into groups. If you look at the top of this figure, you see a red line. Those are the chronic crime street segments, about the 1% of streets that produce about 25% of crime. And you can see they stay high throughout the period. So for the most part, though of course there are streets that change their trajectories over time, some going up and some going down. But the bottom line is there's a tremendous amount of stability. It's not that every year the world is different. Crime concentrates in the same streets, tend to have high crime problems year to year. So hopefully you've got a good sense of the idea of why we should be thinking about hotspots of crime, because crime is very concentrated in cities. There are a relatively small number of streets producing an awful lot of the crime. And there's a lot of stability. It's pretty much, not always, but pretty much the same streets year to year. So in criminology, the largest application of this sort of work has been in the area of deterrence and surveillance, mostly around the police. In other words, if you send police to hotspots, what happens? So I think the first thing to recognize in this is that, and I probably should have said this earlier, but it's not just that crime is very concentrated at hotspots. This is a portrait of the hotspots in Seattle. The bottom right of the screen is what we normally would consider delinquency areas. These are the poor and disadvantaged parts of the city. That's not to say all the areas of disadvantage. Right on the seashore, for example, tends to be a little nicer, but overall. And you can see there are hotspots in those areas, but most of the streets, the vast majority of the streets, are not hotspots. Matter of fact, the majority of streets don't have crime at all within a single year. In the northern part of the city, which is the nicer parts where people want to live, in very pretty mountains overlooking water and things of this sort, you can see they also have hotspots, right? And for your design purposes, note that, for example, in the north, there's red dots going up a street, an arterial road. Arterial roads tend to be centers for crime hotspots. By the way, the largest number of crime hotspots in the city is the downtown area where everyone shops. It's a shopping district, not the delinquency area of town. And I just want to focus in Seattle on this area, which is the less advantaged area of the city. The dark color is like high chronic with the thick lines, and the brown color, those are the hotspots, basically. The yellow and green lines you see, those are crimes either with very little crime in a year or no crime at all. And as you can see, in what is traditionally thought of in Seattle as sort of delinquency areas or problem areas, most of the streets have very little crime. So this reinforces the idea that if you want to think about doing something about the crime problem, you need to focus in on those streets that are contributing a good deal to those. And to be frank, it's probably best to ignore streets that don't have any crime. It's sort of a waste of effort. In policing, for example, would have negative consequences. When the police go down the street, they could stop someone or do other things that people may not like. Okay, so we have these hot spots, right? So one of the questions becomes, well, what makes them hot, right? Well, I've already mentioned something. It turns out there are more hot spots on arterial roads, as you might expect, more people around, more shopping, and other things of that sort. But here's, in this slide, you're looking at a study we did of juvenile crime hotspots, also in Seattle. And if you look where the blue is shaded, those are the hotspots. Those are the high crime streets for juvenile crime. And as you can see, they tend to be focused shops, malls, restaurants, schools, and youth centers. Why? Well, you might say, why does youth crime occur around shops, malls, restaurants, schools, and youth centers? Because that's where kids hang out. That's their activity spaces. So that's one of the things to think about as you think about what can be done in terms of crime. So this is from a regression analysis that includes a much larger model. But these are sort of what were the characteristics of these streets, these chronic crime streets that produce 25% of the crime. What is the characteristics of these streets? How are they different from streets with little or no crime? And you can see, well, if there are a lot of employees in the street, you're much more likely to have a crime hotspot. If there are more residents, you're much more likely to have a crime hotspot. That's just sort of saying more people, more activity. If there are high-risk juveniles that live in the street, kids who are on probation at school and things like that, that also tends to contribute to whether it's a crime hotspot. Property values actually being lower, that should be, well, that's an odds ratio. Property value, if property crime values are higher, it's less likely to be a hotspot. If there's physical disorder in the street, it's much more likely to be a hotspot. And as I told you before, as we saw on the map, if it's an arterial road, it's much more likely to be a hotspot. Now, I put in collective efficacy, but I'm going to leave that out for a minute because I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But many of these aspects of characteristics of these streets are what many people would call opportunity features, things you can use deterrence or other measures to do something about. Okay, so as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the area where this work has had most impact so far, that I should note that I'm working on a large project in Maryland, the United States, on social interventions at crime hotspots. But so far, the place where we've seen most of this is in the case of policing. And underlying this idea is that surveillance, the police being there, will deter criminals or reduce opportunities in other ways, for example, through problem-oriented policing. Okay, let me just note something interesting, that when I began my research, the consensus among criminologists was the police could not prevent crime. David Bailey said in a well-known book called Policing for the Future in 1994, he said, the police do not prevent crime. This is one of the best kept secrets of modern life. Experts know it, the police know it, but the public does not know it. Yet the police pretend that they are society's best defense against crime. This is a myth. And Gotts and Hershey, two well-known criminologists, in their book on theory, say basically the same thing at that time. So actually, when I did this early work and I saw that crime was concentrated at hotspots, I thought, well, maybe police don't deter crime because they're not using the right strategies. Maybe they're not focusing themselves in the proper way. So Larry Sherman and I, in the early 1990s, we developed a randomized trial in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in which we identified 110 crime hotspots. These hotspots had 100 or more calls to the police for crime in a year. And we randomly assigned 55 to treatment and 55 to control. And we tripled the amount of patrol at the treatment hotspots. Now, I should note, control hotspots also got patrol because if you call the police come. You don't want to deny people that service. But in this case, we tried to increase the amount of patrol. From December through July, we were able to do that. And the police, we actually used systematic observations of the police on these streets. But they were able to keep at least 2 to 3 times the dosage of police patrol in experimental sites. And you can see that crime was reduced in experimental versus control sites by about 20%. During the summer, all this fell apart because police went on vacation, kids got out of school, and the amount of free time that could be allocated in patrol to the experimental hotspots declined. But anyway, this study was the first study that showed that if you reallocate the way policing are patrolled, you could have a significant impact in crime. And I think at this point, the argument the police can't prevent crime has been pretty much undone. Now, there have been a lot of studies since the original Minneapolis experiment, and this is from a meta-analysis done by Anthony Braga and colleagues, and it shows that if you the center line is or 1 is zero effect, and then to the right is the deterrence effect, to the left is a backfire effect. Though there are studies that seem to show backfires, the vast majority of the studies, I think something like 65 out of 72 or 62 out of 72, show a deterrent effect, and it has an overall significant deterrent effect for hotspots policing of different types. So the idea of focusing on hotspots has been found to be effective. In a paper I wrote recently with Anthony Braga, in which we used a different statistical technique to estimate affected places, it turns out using traditional measures like Cohen's d are biased, we found about a 16% average decline in crime across the 70 hotspot studies. So one of the questions you'd ask is, well, if you push down on a hotspot, aren't you likely for crime to just pop up in the next street or two over? This is the idea of displacement. Displacement was sort of the boogeyman for place-based or micro-place-based interventions, because it was like a balloon model. It suggested that if you push down, it has to come up elsewhere. So I ran an experiment in Jersey City, New Jersey, a number of years ago, and in that we identified 2 hotspots. They were a small group of streets. One was a prostitution site, that's the left side, and the other was a drug crime and actually violent crime site. And the results of our studies suggest something quite different. If you look at for example, at the right of your screen for the drug activities, the intervention comes where that line on the left is, and you can see that from the intervention, the blue line, which is the target area or the hotspot, the police were able to reduce crime significantly. But if you believe in the balloon model, then in streets near, but one we call catchment area, street around it and 2 streets around it, you should have seen an increase in crime. But you don't see that, neither on the drug crime site nor the prostitution site. A crime in these 2 catchment areas goes down. And that suggests what Ronald Clark and I have termed a diffusion of crime control benefits. So I didn't include it, but Braga also did a systematic review on whether there's displacement or not. He found that in most studies there wasn't displacement, and in fact the effect was significant and in favor of diffusion of benefits to areas nearby. Now, I just say something about mechanisms are very important. The question becomes, what's the mechanism for a resistance to spatial displacement? Why is it that most of the studies now do not indicate spatial displacement? Sometimes it happens, but in most of the studies it doesn't. And here's the reason. One is simply what I call the crime is coupled to place. In other words, it's the case there are reasons why crime is where it is, usually opportunity reasons. In other words, for juveniles, we mentioned before, if you have a juvenile-like place where the kids can play games and stuff like that, you're going to attract a lot of juveniles. You get juvenile crime. Bars, for example, attract adult crime, at least in terms of fights and violence and things of this sort. Bus stops tend to be attractors. Certain types of facilities are crime attractors. So one reason why it does nearby is the exact same benefits or opportunities don't exist necessarily a block or 2 over. For example, in the prostitution site in Jersey City, there was an abandoned factory building. And that was just a great place for prostitutes to take their johns to carry out their activities and to carry out their work. And in the catchment area nearby, there wasn't a place like that. But there's also a social psychological element here. For example, one respondent arrested the drug crime site explained when he was asked about why he didn't move from that site when there's been a lot of police there, he said, money won't be the same, that he'd have to start from scratch. It takes time to build up customers. In other words, you deal especially with crimes that involve making money, you have to think in terms of business as well. If you go to that if you move where you're working, it's going to be harder to get your clientele and rebuild your business. Another is that if there are certain places that are good for committing a certain kind of crime, they may not like it if there are already people there and you come there, so it can be dangerous to move. There's a very personal thing. One of the prostitutes told us, I walked over to the graveyard cemetery. That's where there was a different prostitution site. And I didn't think I'd make money. It was unfamiliar to me. I didn't know the guys, the clients. On Corneliuson, you recognize the guys. I know from being out there every day on Corneliuson, I know the people, the faces. It's different. In my area, I know the people. Up in the hill, I don't really know the people at that end of town. And just from their perspective, you have to understand, from drug dealers, from other offenders, like they know a certain area, a certain street. They know who's going to call the police, who isn't. What they call the good guys are the people who won't call the police, for example. The bad guys are the residents who call the police on them. Anyway, so I think there are also some good reasons for a resistance to spatial displacement. Okay, so I've recently done you can't really see this, but I've recently done a study in Baltimore, Maryland, using funds from the National Institute of Justice. And we did about 12,000 interviews on just 450 streets over a 6-year period. And what we did there, one thing interesting me there was social aspects of places that might contribute to crime. In sociology, there's an idea, it's called collective efficacy, and it revolves around the idea that if people are more cohesive with their neighbors, if they're more willing to intervene in problems, there's greater informal social control on those streets. And informal social control in criminology goes at least back at the geographical level to the Chicago School in the early 20th century. But I found that this idea worked pretty well on crime hotspots. In other words, if I asked people, you can't see this here, but if I asked whether people trusted people in their street, I believe on the hotspot streets, it was 90 on the streets with little crime, 90% of people trusted people in the street. On the streets that were the highest violent crime and drug crime streets, called the combined, only 30 some odd percent trusted people who live on their street. It's in general, people in your block can be trusted. It's 49% on the combined spots and 84% on the cold spots. So you get the message that people on hotspot streets don't trust their neighbors so much. They're not as involved with those people, but they're also less willing to intervene. When we asked a series of questions about if there was a fight in front of your home, would you be willing to intervene? A series of questions, and people who lived on hotspots were significantly less likely than people who lived on cold spots. By the way, they weren't not likely at all, but the point is that one thing to think about as you think about design is it's not only about opportunity features in the streets, it's also about the way in which people understand and interact with their neighbors. Okay, so we come back to our slide. So location, location, location. My work in criminology has pushed the idea that we need to focus in on high crime places, on crime hotspots, if we want to do something about the crime problem.